My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Randy Freund. It's June 16th, 2025, and we're at Vitae Springs in Salem. Randy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
First question to get things started is why wine?
I grew up in Texas. Texas doesn't have much of a culture of wine. I think that has changed, since I was young. But my dad was interested in wine kind of when I was ending high school, like middle to end of high school. So I started tasting it occasionally and finding it interesting. And he was getting into a lot of Rieslings, Bordeaux, so kind of some of the beginner wine enthusiast stuff. And so I got chances to try those, kind of spurred my interest a little bit. And then in college, I was studying computer science at Texas A&M, and I wasn't really very satisfied with the idea of sitting behind a computer for the rest of my life. And so I when I was, I think, a junior in college, we went and took a trip here to the Willamette Valley with my parents because they used to live in Vancouver, Washington. So my sister really wanted to come check out the Pacific Northwest and see where they, used to live and everything. And when we were here, we went wine tasting, and I wasn't actually 21 yet, so I was not able to taste any wine at the wine tastings. But we went to Brooks Winery, had a really phenomenal time with Jerry, who gave us just an incredible tasting that really was at a great time, and for me trying to kind of figure out what I was wanting to do. And it showed me a world where you can be kind of working with the land and creating this beautiful product, and have all of these incredibly direct feedback mechanisms that I felt were really lacking in kind of the more virtual world behind the computer. So that, especially, at Brooks, there's a huge biodynamics focus. So kind of getting into, that was kind of my first foray into regenerative agriculture in general. So after that, I guess another thing that really got me into wine, funnily enough, was watching the first Somm movie. I kind of was I was pretty entranced by the idea of just all of these incredible places and all the incredible wines to try. So that happened, that same summer where we went to Brooks and everything. And so the year after that, I dropped out of college and I went and woofed in France for the year, which woofing is a thing that we do now here at Vitae Springs, which is called Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. It's a cultural exchange program where you get to kind of spend some time, learning about regenerative agriculture on the farm, and often, depending on the farm that you're at, there are different products that they'll do, and you get to learn about them, and just get to experience. It's a great way to travel on a lower budget. And so I worked for several months in Beaujolais, mostly in the vineyard, which was just such an awesome experience. The winemaker and person running the farm there was a really awesome dude who really helped me kind of build a better work ethic, which was really great. And so just, over the course of the year and then ending with a harvest in Alsace, which was just absolutely incredible, I really got my first experience into working with the land, working outside, working with your body all day, and it just was really awesome. So over that time, I had decided to join the wine industry. I didn't know yet what capacity. But while I was in Europe, my family ended up joining me, and we went on a Brooks cruise from Switzerland to Amsterdam. And on that cruise, I got to meet Janie Brooks and meet Chris and connect with them a little bit. And I ended up getting the opportunity through that to work in the cellar at Brooks Wines in 2018, the next year. And so it was a really awesome opportunity that I love. I love the people that, I met there. They really, in 2017 in France, I learned a lot about the vineyard, but didn't have too much experience in the winery. Getting a year of experience in the winery and just learning the basics and learning how to taste and everything was just such an awesome experience. And I think that the Oregon wine industry is just such a beautiful place to land because the community here is so welcoming, so enthusiastic, and it's really a hotspot of regenerative agriculture. And I think that is ultimately the thing I'm most interested in, even as far as wine is concerned, is kind of that potential, which I think we'll probably get into later. But I would say overall, wine was a combination of the beauty here in Oregon that really allowed me to fall in love with it, as well as just being able to drink and learn about the world through wine is just so much fun. And, now, so Alexis, my soon-to-be wife, is studying for the Master of Wine test and stuff, and so just in my helping her study for blind tasting and everything, it's such an incredible experience to just be able to explore the world through wine, through, these people that have spent years and decades of their life to create these beautiful products that represent the place where they are and often represent incredible farming practices or incredibly unique points of biodiversity that I just think make some really beautiful products.
I'm curious about your sort of initial impressions. You mentioned obviously the biggest kind of initial thought for you was in Europe. Tell me about what you thought when you were on a vineyard for the first time or digging into that work for the first time.
Yeah. So funnily enough, the first job that I had in the wine industry, like over in France, is kind of one of the... So the job was, I was in the Languedoc-Roussillon in like the southwest of France on this really old vineyard where they had a bunch of vines that were planted like right after World War II. It was like 1946, 1947. And these vines had, I'm not sure exactly what it was, whether it was trunk disease or rodent pressure or, there's a lot of different things that can really hurt vines. And so they had died. And so my first job was to go down and I just kicked all of these vines over to try to get them so out of the way so that you can replace them with new ones. And as I had no idea what I was doing outside of the physical, okay, how can I actually more effectively, get rid of these vines or whatever. But the significance of what I was doing was totally lost on me. So it's really only after here at Vitae Springs, having been able to work with old vines for a while, that I'm appreciating the significance of kind of that first thing. But a lot of other tasks in the vineyard, it was in general in France that I was learning was weed control, there was working with the trellising systems, kind of the most basic kind of shared functions that you need to do in a vineyard.
What did you think of the work? What attracted you to the work?
I think what attracted me to the work was the idea of kind of intelligently using my work to really have an immediate feedback. There's a feedback of, okay, I can, whenever you're raising a wire in the trellising system or whatever, especially here in a vertical shoot positioning, learning all the intricacies of how you can do a better job or do it a little bit faster and constantly have these improvement mechanisms. And it's very immediate visceral feedback that is almost a little gamified. It's very easy, especially to kind of gamify all of the tasks and to, there's such a variety in the vineyard that, at any given point, right now, there's so many different tasks that I need to go do in the vineyard that, all of them need to get done. So I have the luxury of choosing all of these different incredibly important tasks that give you immediate feedback. And then in 2017, I did harvest for the first time. But 2019, when I did harvest for the first time, with the grapes that I grew, is I think really when it all clicked as far as every action that you take, you finally get rewarded for in harvest. And that's why harvest, it's so much work and it's a lot of labor and it's grueling, but also you're reaping the rewards of all of the hard work that you've put in for the past several months and several years. So it's so incredibly rewarding. So you have all of these immediate, incredibly nice feedbacks of learning and improving on how to do these small tasks. And then you get this incredibly awesome reward for all of your hard work at the end of each season. That's just so beautiful. And, the fact that we get to capture that in a bottle and drink it 20, 30 years later is just, I think, one of the most incredible things about wine.
So you mentioned meeting Janie and Chris and going to work at Brooks. Tell me about that work. Obviously, you said that was kind of your first time seeing the wine side, the winery side of things. Mm-hmm. So tell me about your, I guess, impressions of that work and what you remember from that harvest.
Oh man, I mean, so my impressions about the work, as opposed to vineyard work, which I think is about like working with systems to try to get, like, you know, if a few vines, you know, end up out of your trellising system, like it might not be worth it to go back there, and it might be worth it to, you know, allow a few shoots to go rogue but get more work done or whatever. But in the winery, it's all about detail. It's about like, no, I have to consider, you know, the vessel that I'm going into. I have to consider all the different places that the wine are going to touch so that I can sanitize them, so that I can keep this incredible product like at a high quality. So really at Brooks, being able to kind of learn and be in an environment where you're just trying to really do like a work towards perfection and like do as good of a job as you can possibly do, because, you know, you're trying to prepare the way for the wine to get in there or whatever. So I think that it's kind of the detail-oriented side that I think winery work is so rewarding for, and it shows in the finished product that you make. And then as far as the harvest goes and everything, you know, I think, you know, 2018 was one of the best years of my life. And, you know, that's where I met Alexis. She was an intern for Harvest. The assistant winemaker at the time, Claire, she set us up for, like, she paired off everybody for days off together. You know, she ended up pairing us off, which I am super thankful for. You know, so, and then, it was just such an incredible experience overall. You know, I'm still friends with everyone that worked the harvest. You know, I'd still love to hang out with them at any point in time. And then as far as the actual like work during harvest goes, you know, it was my harvest in 2017 in Alsace was mostly, you know, doing some harvesting, occasional winery days, but like mostly it was harvesting in the vineyard. Being a part of like a harvest crew and that kind of sense of community that reminded me a lot of, you know, sports and growing up and everything, but just having like shared goals where, you know, it's a lot of work to do, but also you are going to put in your best work so that other people don't have as much work to do, and kind of like mutual camaraderie was such an incredible aspect. And I think it's just that's one of the things that I guess maybe I didn't know I was like going to get into, or wasn't expecting, you know, since I had been working in the cellar. I had a lot of the like experiences working with wine and, you know, tasting juice or tasting wine or whatever, but kind of that like shared community aspect was just broadened so much during harvest in a really awesome way, I think. And then, you know, during the other things of harvest in 2018, there was some really fun stuff. Like we did at Brooks from Highland, we got Riesling with a lot of botrytis. So we did like a few days of berry selecting to try to make a Trocken Bier in Auslese. You know, 2018 was also just a beautiful vintage. The fruit we were working with was, you know, just beautiful. The wines are tasting awesome, and so fun to be able to like, you know, be hit with a little memory every time you go to drink a bottle of it. Yeah. Sorry, I guess one more last thing that I definitely remember from harvest that was really cool. So Myron Redford lives right down the street from Brooks, and so at the end of harvest, we got to go over to his house. And whenever you go over to his house, you get to he'll usually let everybody pick out a bottle of birth year wine because he has a really awesome cellar and everything. And so in the cellar there, I managed to find a Vitae Springs vineyard, 1990, I think it was 1995, which is actually not my birth year, but he let me take it anyways because it was right after we had technically bought the vineyard, but before we, you know, had moved in or anything like that. And it was Gewürztraminer, which is no longer on the property because it didn't, Joel, the previous vineyard manager, said it was too vigorous and hard to make, hard to sell, which common complaints about Gewürztraminer, but it's, especially having worked in Alsace and really fallen in love with the variety there, like I think Gewürztraminer can make some of the most beautiful textural wines white wines that there are, and I absolutely love them. So getting the chance to try, 20-year-old Gewürztraminer from the property that I won't, you know, hopefully I'll be able to try it again in, you know, 6 or 7 years if I can plant it out sometime soon. But it was really, really awesome to get to try my favorite variety from the vineyard that I was soon to be managing.
We'll get to that part in a minute because I'm excited to hear about that. But I also have a Myron Redford birth year wine in my collection, 1981 Clos du Bois. Telling everybody exactly how old I am. So that cellar is incredible.
Oh my God, it's
incredible experience.
And he's just so generous and such a. That was such a fun experience.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And we went with a pretty big group, so we all got to taste. So we got to taste like 8 or 9 of these awesome, like, just little glimpses into history that is just such a unique experience.
So you mentioned Vitae Springs coming onto your radar right about that time. So tell me about that kind of the parallel story that was going on and how this became part of your life.
So my sister's husband, Carrie, was working as a chemical engineer, and he, so this is while I was in France. I had just gone to France, was working in vineyards. He looked at vineyards in his off time, which is like, man, when I retire, I think it would be really cool to like buy a vineyard. I love wine. He was also really getting into wine. My sister and her husband were also like, they were also a big part of like why we went to Brooks Winery and stuff. And like parallel to this, they were, really enjoying wine. So Carrie was just looking at vineyards in his off time. So my mom grew up in South Dakota in a farming background. My dad is a business professor at UT. So he was really into wine. My dad was really into wine. He really has helped a lot of people like learn about business, helped a lot of people run their businesses. And so for him, it was largely of kind of a legacy of wanting to actually start his own business and falling in love with wine. The wine industry, personally, was something I was planning on doing anyways. So I think kind of through the culmination of the farming background and my dad's interest in starting a business, that's kind of the impetus. And then, so my dad found out that Carrie was looking at all of these vineyards, and then he started thinking about it. And I can't remember if that was before or after the cruise, whether like all that kind of was happening. I think it was actually before. So then on the cruise, it was awesome to get to go with my family and, check out some of Alsace where I was going to do harvest later in the year, get to check out a lot of Germany and just drink some of the most incredible Rieslings in the world, especially. So that was just so much fun. And after that, while working we had kind of at the end of my trip, we had kind of decided as a family, like, okay, I think this would be a really awesome project to pursue. Let's look into buying a vineyard and trying to run a vineyard. And so in 2018, when I was here at Brooks, that's when we had kind of started the process of really looking around for different properties. Vitae Springs Vineyard, which is now a good time to just tell about. So it was planted by the Van Valkenburg family starting in the late 70s. You have Earl Van Valkenburg, who was stationed in Germany. And so when he came back, he brought back some cuttings of different German and varieties. He planted them in his mother's garden and then started planting out the vineyard in 1978. And so, we were really falling in love with German varieties. Throughout all of our looking, we found a bunch of different awesome properties, but none really like did I fall in love with as much as whenever I first came here, because I love botcher-sized wines. Like, I really fell in love with them in Alsace, especially, where you're just like getting this incredible concentration of character, and like often the selection of Grand Noble. Those are like some of the most age-worthy wines. Like, I love them. I think they add so much character and whenever we came here, I remember just asking him, whenever he was showing us the place, and I was like curious if they got much botrytis. And anytime I'd asked that answer before, everyone was like, no, absolutely never. Like, I don't know why you're asking me that. Like, no, we don't get, like, I have to spray for it and stuff, but like, no, we don't get it. But, there's just fog here that we get every single day, and especially like in the end of the growing season, that just clears up kind of, usually around like 10:30 or 11. And so, especially on this side of the property. And so it really just, so whenever I asked him that question and he answered with that, it was that in addition to just, the actual beauty of the property and the idea of just working with these awesome Germanic varieties. And, Vitae Springs Vineyard has we have 12 acres planted between the two properties because Earl Van Valkenburg's son, Joel, ended up buying the adjacent property and planting it out to Pinot Noir about 20 years later. And so the about half of the property is Pinot Noir, and then about half the property is split between Pinot Gris, Riesling, Grüner Veltliner, and Müller-Thurgau. And the only other vineyard that, when we were looking, really had that same kind of variety of things was Duvert, which I think, interesting timeline, I guess. But I love that vineyard. I think they're making some really cool stuff too. Like their Melon de Bourgogne is really awesome. But the idea of, okay, if we're trying to do a small family winery, if we want to do like a tasting room and stuff, like being able to not just have Pinot Noir, but a lot of other different varieties will allow us to have hopefully kind of a wine for every person that comes into the tasting room to like. And so I definitely fell in love with this place. I think everyone else did, but it's definitely me that I was the one that was like, oh my God, this is the one that I love so much. Like, this is awesome. And my parents live up here part of the year. My dad's still working in Texas, so he's still in Texas for half the year. And so it also is nice that it had two houses. So, I can live with my wife in one house and then my parents can live in the other house, which is very, that's kind of another reason that this place just really was kind of the perfect fit for us, I think. And the farming practices here there's some things I really appreciated, like Joel didn't till. And so, while he did do a little bit of herbicide for economic reasons, so much of the vineyard still had plenty of opportunity for like long-term mycorrhizal development, and really like building up that soil health. And, these vines have just had such an opportunity to develop, and cultivate biodiversity in the soil and develop like their own unique ecosystem. I guess maybe is now a good time to move on to like kind of, since now we have the vineyard and kind of what we've done with it. So
first, before you do that, just sort of describe what it looked like when you got here and what you sort of saw as the first steps you wanted to take.
Sure. So one thing that there's a lot more bare ground before, for landscaping purposes. It looked really beautiful. It was really like well-maintained landscaping and everything. But definitely a lot of like bare ground, which we soon realized after, a year that, okay, it's because it was herbicide, because now it's no longer bare and it's pretty hard to keep it that way. But, we shifted to organic certified. So, we didn't want to use any, and I didn't want to use any herbicide. I guess maybe a good thing to point out is, so in 2018, when I was working at Brooks, we got the chance to go down to the American Biodynamic Conference in San Francisco. And that was a really awesome opportunity to get to really learn more about biodynamics, but more importantly for me, regenerative agriculture, good soil practices and stuff. David Montgomery, who wrote, it's Dirt? I think it's just called Dirt. It's an awesome book about kind of how not taking care of your dirt or really soil, especially through tillage, has caused the collapse of a lot of societies in history. And it's really, soil buildup naturally, if you don't do anything, takes a really long time. Tilling the soil can harm it a lot faster than it's easy to rebuild it, especially just through like passivity. And so kind of getting my first glimpse into like in France, I was kind of learning a little bit about regenerative agriculture, but with the language barrier, I definitely was not able to really develop kind of the more intellectual side of that until I think the Biodynamic Conference was such a good opportunity for that. And so that was kind of where my head was at, especially coming into having this property in 2019. Since we've had it, I haven't tilled except 1 year around one block of Pinot Noir. We did a little experimental like patch to try to see if we can help to control voles. And then I'll occasionally do tilling for like garden purposes, but not in the vineyard or among the perennials. I don't till, which I think that there can be like intelligent tilling, especially like, if you do it and immediately replant, or, it's going to be cold enough that you won't have bacterial die-off and stuff until it gets warmer. So you can like do it intelligently, but I think that ideally I really fell in love with kind of the idea of grazing-based viticulture that you see kind of down at Antiquum Farms, over at Piscina's Ranch down in California. So I guess this is kind of where my train of thought goes. I think what regenerative agriculture is fundamentally, like how it departs from industrialized agriculture, that like the kind of systems that we've had. I think that the easiest way for me to frame it, is kind of it's extractive agriculture versus regenerative agriculture, where so industrial agriculture is where we are using incredible amounts of energy, primarily in the form of fossil fuels, to reduce the complexity of these natural systems to a place that is manageable with our technologies. So we reduce all of the incredibly complex, biodiversity that's going on in the soil. You have all of these different layers of, the fungal networks and roots and bacteria interacting and helping each other out and forming relationships that we reduce into, okay, the plant needs these nutrients at these ratios and everything. And that's because if we reduce it to that, then it's very easy to then say, okay, well then we just need to develop this spray plant, and then we can reduce the variety in the system of, and get rid of all of the other things that are competing for those nutrients, and we can just give the plant those nutrients directly and kind of streamline the process. And I think that we are only able to do that in like the paradigm of incredibly cheap energy. And even in that paradigm, it has all of these negative consequences, from disrupting the nutrient cycles, and causing nitrogen buildup in water that causes toxic algae blooms and everything. Industrial agriculture is reducing all of that complexity into something that it can kind of work with and manage very easily. Whereas regenerative viticulture, or regenerative agriculture in general, is trying to work with that variety and do practices that kind of accept that variety and try to like work with systems to manage that variety. So it's, so if you have all of this complex microbiome going on in the soil, then you are able to access the nutrients in the soil. Then the plants are able to communicate effectively with each other, and assuming that you have a pretty good ecosystem set up in the first place, you can manage that ecosystem in a very good direction. And as opposed to industrialized agriculture, the more extractive, where you're having to import all of these off-farm products in order to try to make up for this variety, the other side of it is that you are also, if you're trying to cultivate, or if you're trying to get rid of all of the things that are the other things growing in the soil, then the only biology that you have underground is going to be the vineyard root system, which is just an incredibly non-resilient system. Monocultures in general have a lot of problems that stem from that. For example, and I think a lot of the vineyard problems that we face in general stems from monocultures. So even my hopefully soon to be incredibly regenerative vineyard system, that has animals grazing in it year round, blah, 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 all of that is still lacking to a degree, which I think probably I'll get more into this later when we're talking about kind of the future. I think it's still lacking into a degree, as it's still a monoculture of vines. And I think that a more intelligent, more resilient vineyard system is going to be incorporating more trees, is going to be incorporating more variety. Because I think the downsides of not incorporating variety are primarily, I think, in the near future going to be shown through lack of resiliency, whether it's through to drought, to weather events, to fungal pressures. For example, I think that if you have I kind of think of the soil very similar to our gut microbiome, where like if you have a healthy immune system, if you have a healthy gut microbiome, like you can be exposed to a lot of different new bacteria or viruses or whatever that you're able to defend yourself against or whatever through sufficient variety of different organisms that can handle those. Or because of the amount of different organisms, no organisms are able to develop an incredible advantage over another. You know, like if you have two species in an area and one has an advantage over the other, then it's going to like completely dominate that ecosystem. Even if you just add a third species, then you're going to have all of these more complex game theory interactions where if one species gets an advantage, then that might be negated or give an advantage to another species that's able to kind of create some sort of equilibrium. And the more and more you add species to that, the more stable of a system that you're building. So I think that, you know, a lot of the pressures that we're facing right now from viruses in the vineyard, from a lot of disease pressure, I think that it's really, really hard to deal with those problems, especially if you don't have a healthy soil ecosystem. If you don't have that like microbiology in your gut, you're going to have to, even with modern medicine, you're going to face a lot of problems trying to deal with it in that kind of reduced variety way. The idea of then, instead of that, of trying to observe and work with kind of the flows of natural energy systems and trying to figure out how to work with them and work with them really, I think, to build biodiversity is one of the big things, is I think kind of one of the biggest problems that is stemming from industrialized or extractive viticulture is that we've reduced the variety in order to solve these problems. So one of our tasks is to increase the biodiversity, to increase our variety.
So tell me about how you put that into place here.
So, you know, a lot of the general regenerative viticulture principles are really good at kind of working with natural systems in order to build that variety. So from cover cropping, from the lack of some things like tilling or herbicide, and, you know, what I'm now trying to do, but I have not really incorporated into the vineyard yet, is having animals in the vineyard to both increase biodiversity a little bit more through, you know, like their gut biome and everything, but also to kind of speed up the process of those natural cycles of like breaking down vegetation, that getting, you know, used by the soil and like decomposing, and then build like animals, I think, intelligently grazed can really accelerate those natural processes of soil building. And so what I've done so far, I think, has mostly been trying to kind of wean the vines off of a lot of foliar nutrients. So I'm still spraying fungicide because, you know, powdery mildew and botrytis are both huge pressures here that I have to manage, but I'm trying to minimize the foliar applications of nutrients, but I've kind of tapered it off over the past few years as I've tried to increase the speed of soil development and everything. So, because I don't want the vines to struggle and I don't want to, you know, lose vines, or I want to be able to manage that transition really well, but I also in the long term don't want to be spraying foliar nutrients, and I want to, because I really want to be keeping off-farm inputs to as low as possible, and kind of just closing a lot of those supply chains here. And so as far as other things I've done in the vineyard, you know, so I'd say one of the biggest departures is just, you know, there used to be one spray of glyphosate in row between the vines to not have to deal with any weed pressure. I hate that term. I shouldn't have said weed. But this, in the nature of regenerative agriculture, I think of weeds as like more of a pioneer species of species that are able to perform well in disturbed ground that doesn't have a lot of complexity. Like they're able to just take over disturbed ground well, which means if you have a vineyard system where you're trying to keep everything bare of ground, then yeah, the only thing that you're going to be dealing with are the plants that are able to do well in that environment. But so in order to not have to deal with, you know, a lot of congestion from different plants growing into the fruiting zone and everything, there was one spray of glyphosate that I did not do. And so, first year, didn't really see much grass growth. Second year, started to see a little bit. I think it was 2021 maybe, that it was like grass Armageddon and like just so much grass everywhere. And and starting in 21 and 22, I started using a scythe in row to manage the in row vegetation because I don't have animals in the vineyard yet to do it for me. So, and I guess I'm a big nerd about kind of energy. And so for me, if I'm not, we don't have a in-row mower, like a between the vine mower that will work well for our vines, because we have a lot of vines that, go kind of weave in the row, they're old vines. So the kind of in-row or between the vine mower that we'd have to get is very expensive. So, lower cost solutions, the most common one would be using a weed whacker to do it. And for me, that just makes absolutely no sense, because it's like I'm using, like, if you're thinking about how much energy is in, like, a gallon of, like, the fuel that you're using for that, like, that equates to, like, years. I think a barrel of oil equates to about 4 or 5 years of, like, a human work. Mm-hmm. So, like, I guess maybe it's a 60th. So that equates to, like, 10, 15 days of you working as hard as you possibly can to just run that, instead of you working for that same amount of time, like just with a scythe that does it. It might not do as pretty of a job, especially because it takes a lot more skill. And so I've gotten better so I can cut the grass, but I still am not as skilled, I think, to do really good looking maintenance with it. But, it's really, I think it's an awesome example of our very, very energy-rich society not really considering that into how we're making decisions, versus historically when you didn't have this kind of energy surplus and you didn't have the option to, use this almost magical machine to do your work for you. So like, it's like the kind of old school scythes that they have been using in the old world for a long time. They are designed to work with your body. Like they're designed to do exactly this job, because this is what they've been doing this is how they've either been using scythes or animals to perform this task in vineyards for thousands of years. So I think that there's probably a few other scythe users here in Oregon in vineyards, but not very many of us, I don't think. But so that was kind of one of my, I guess, innovations, which is not. But that being said, I am pretty excited to get the system set up so that I can have animals in the vineyard year round, because it's a lot of work to do that much mowing and I think I'm a size where I can kind of, manage it by just doing it and working a lot. But, also if I were a 70-acre vineyard, I would have to find a bunch of people who would be happy to be like, yeah, Randy, we'll use this scythe instead of a weed whacker, So, as far as other practices, I definitely leave the cover crop a little bit longer, depending on how much rain we're getting in the spring, especially, that kind of is determining how much I'm mowing. But Joel liked to keep the grass really low for kind of both the aesthetics and kind of human function, because, especially if you have bad allergies, being out in tall grass can just be a nightmare. So, and then, I guess the other huge departure from Vitae Springs is that they hadn't been making wine, so they'd just been selling their grapes for several years. I know that they were making wine. I don't know exactly like when they were making wine. I know that they made it for a little while, but then they stopped making it, and then they just sold all of their fruit. And so starting in 2019, we sold most of our fruit. We kept 4 tons of Pinot back that I made at craft wineries that year, where I made half of it into Pinot Noir, 1 ton of it into Rosé, 1 ton of it into White Pinot. And those are really fun. I love the wines from 19. That was a beautiful vintage. Loved working at craft. It was such a fun environment. Met some really good friends that I'm still friends with to this day. And then 2020, I honestly kind of just mostly forget about that year, because On the vineyard side, obviously we have the fires. On the other side, we have the pandemic.
Pretty forgettable year.
Pretty forgettable year, And in 2020, actually, we were fortunate enough to have, so we were selling all of our fruit that year. We kind of just randomly had decided, we don't want to, we made wine in 2019, wanted to figure out more, focus on, what are we going to do in the future, but probably not making wine this next year. And so we were selling all the fruit, and all of the winery partners that we worked with, we didn't have fruit insurance that year. So all the winery partners we worked with, we ended up, they paid us half the cost as normal, so we kind of got to share that burden, which was really awesome and really appreciated. I think a few of them ended up bottling some wine. Some of them ended up just bulking it out to California. But here in South Salem, we were heavily walloped by the smoke. I think even a little bit earlier than I think some of our other vineyards a little further north of us. And then 2021, we made basically a ton of each of our different varieties on the property, so that was really fun. In 21, we started making wine at Keeler Vineyards when it was a really fun group of people there. So, craft was really great to kind of get a really good glimpse into more kind of minimal intervention winemaking. They were working with so many different varieties that were so fun. Laura and Meredith were the winemakers, and they were so nice, so happy to help me with my wine, so happy to answer questions, to taste things, to, bounce ideas off of. So that was really fun. And then at Keeler, it was really fun because there were just so many different custom crush clients there. So you had so many different brains to bounce ideas off of. We were kind of the new kids in the cellar, so it was, we were happy to work with everybody, and everyone was really friendly. And there are some, definitely in 21 and 22 working there, coordinating that many people in a cellars definitely requires a different kind of winemaking than we have the luxury of now, making it our own site where we can kind of do things at our own pace. We like doing 8-hour press cycles for our Riesling, which is kind of a hard sell whenever people are like, hey, I have 3 press lids to get to after you. You can't really kind of take that time. But 21, and we made a ton of each. 22, we sold a little bit of fruit, but kept a lot more. So 22 is when we really scaled up our Pinot production. And then in 2023, Keeler got bought by Antica Terra, and so we ended up making the decision to use the facility here. And by facility here, I mean my mother's garage. And we gutted it. We ended up sourcing most of the equipment either from, either from vineyards and wineries here in Oregon or Washington. There was, we got some of our stuff from Clar Cellars, some of our stuff from, we got our press down from Troon. Just, a lot of scouring wine bids. Not wine bids, not as helpful here. Wine business. There we go. Wine business classifieds to try to find the equipment that we need, because, I think we found out probably June or so. So, we were scrambling to get everything ready by harvest. But we made it, stuck the landing, made some beautiful wine in 23. Did it with, trying to find as reasonably priced equipment as we could and stuff. And, we, made some decisions in 2023. In 22, so I guess maybe I'll pull it back a little bit. In 2019, for my Pinot, I made 2 styles. I did one bin that was entirely destemmed. I did one bin that was entirely whole cluster. And then some of the wine I kept as entirely whole cluster, and then some of the wine I blended together and bottled. So a few years later, after doing a little bit of whole cluster in 21, doing some in 22, in 23 made the decision, especially as we were purchasing equipment, to do all of the Pinot whole cluster. We are a very late site. We tend to, our stems tend to lignify. They tend to ripen enough that, and we tend to not deal a lot with pH pressure, being a high elevation late site. So we can kind of handle that whole cluster. And so and we ended up actually making this hand destemmer. So we did a little bit of destemmed fruit in 2023, mostly just because in my experience, 100% whole cluster ferment is a nightmare to deal with, especially because we like doing punch downs. So changing that to be like 90% with 10% destemmed fruit on top just makes it so much easier to work with. And so, so we did entirely whole cluster pretty much in 2023, except a little destemmer that I built that we used more in 2024. So we did a few bins that were entirely destemmed, and it's fun. It's just like a little wooden frame that has some plastic chicken wire that you can just like rub the grapes over, and it does a better job than $14,000, $15,000 destemmer, but with more labor and a little bit slower. But the quality of grapes is actually really surprising. It's, I preserve a lot of really nice whole berries, it only slows down our sorting line like a little bit, let's say 20% or something. So, you have to have a person or two on the destemmer, so has a bit of a labor thing, but not, it's going to take a while before that adds up to, the $60,000 machine that we'd have to buy to replace it or whatever. So, and then 23 and 24, we're selling still a little bit of fruit to some people who've been working with it for a really long time. But now we're making pretty much all of our wine. Hopefully that answered the question. I don't remember what the question was.
Who even remembers? I want to talk more about the wine in a minute, but I want to talk one more question about the place. Sure. Tell me about your process for getting to know the place. And obviously you mentioned you had ambitions for how to farm it from the beginning. How did you get to know it? How did you start to kind of learn what parts of the vineyard needed what from you?
That's a good question. Biggest thing is just going to be trying kind of observation. Although unfortunately I'm not the most observant person. So, I think for me, the hard part about that question is that I think that realistically, it's kind of harvest is when I learned for each year. Mm-hmm. Especially early on, I wouldn't really know the consequences of actions exactly until they were reflected in harvest. So, transitioning, and the nice thing is, we were working with Jessica Cortell. I have a lot of friends that have managed a lot of organic transitions. So organic transitions are notorious for, vines struggling, it taking a few years for the vines really getting used to a different spray program, and for us too, a lot more competition. And so each variety has kind of faced its own challenge over the past 6 or 7 years, but it's kind of been one at a time. They've kind of been, they've kind of each handled the transition and the increased competition and the different environment differently. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that it tends to be, there's not that much difference, let's say between the Riesling and we have 2 different blocks of Riesling, outside of the fact that there's some young vines in one block and the rest are all old vines. There's not a huge difference, maybe a little bit in terms of ripeness, but there's not a dramatic difference between the Riesling, the 2 Rieslings, I'd say. But pretty dramatic difference between, let's say, the Riesling and Pinot Gris, or, Pinot Gris and Grüner Veltliner, all the different varieties. And also the different clones for Pinot Noir all have pretty significant variety from each other. And so they have taken some time to transition. The yields in each of the varieties had 1 year where it was pretty bad, and then they came back up. So it's I think that it wasn't so much. I think it was more just a little hurdle that they had to get over, and each variety was just a little bit different on when. You could probably think of it in terms of their ability to simultaneously ripen the fruit and build up the reservoir they need of carbohydrates for the next season and everything. So each of them kind of needed a year where maybe they overproduced, or just that was out of balance, and then over the next year they had to kind of more work on storing up more carbohydrates, and then since then they've kind of managed to find good flows. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely a ton of variety in terms of I would say working with a scythe has definitely helped me to to figure out what each block is needs differently, because there's definitely some blocks where I can do one pass and call it good for a season, and then there's some blocks where I have to do a pass every 3 weeks to keep it, because the grass will grow half an inch in an hour, it seems. I just cut that, I swear. So I guess doing everything by hand, I think, is actually I do all the hedging by hand, do all the the things I don't do by hand, I guess, are spraying. Outside of, we have one block that's very steep that if I have an early start and a wet season, that I'll probably do some hand spraying until I'm more confident in the stability of the soil there. But spraying's always with the tractor. Mowing between rows is always with the tractor. But then everything else is done by hand, as far as harvesting, mowing all the stuff between the vines, hedging all the wires, all by hand.
Amazing. So you're talking about the wine earlier. I'm curious. Obviously, you mentioned Alexis part of the project here as well. So tell me about the two of you sort of working together and finding the style you want to produce from here, finding your own what kind of winemaking style.
Yeah, totally. So I think my winemaking style is very minimal intervention, and so this year, for the first time, this last year I started my natural wine brand, where I'm doing zero additions wine, and that is my winemaking style. And Alexis, and that's kind of especially where it started, Alexis's winemaking style is, okay, I want to make the absolute best wine possible. So in 2019, Alexis was doing harvest in the Loire Valley and the Jurazon, so I was making the wine. And I think there's a beautiful elegance to the 2019s, both from the vintage, and I think the 100% whole cluster, our reserve from that year is really shining. I think that the rosé, that is not the style for my kind of winemaking. I think that it was interesting, but not particularly, I liked it, but I didn't love it. I think a lot of people they found it interesting. I did it in, it was the first thing that went into one of Andrew Beckham's Novum. So it was pretty 3 or 4 day long skin contact rosé in this, and it was a pretty natty wine, but before I think I had enough down of the real kind of winemaking principles that I want to do in order to make really high quality natural wine. So I think that, in 2019, and the wines, some of the wines turned out beautifully. Some of the wines definitely, I think the style didn't really mesh well with how I made it and everything. So Alexis came on in 2020 as the winemaker, sort of, except that we were, not really making any wine, and we were made 1 barrel of Pinot Gris. So really, she came on as the winemaker in 2021. And I think that was absolutely, I wanted that to happen because I think especially for Vitae Springs, especially as a brand that we want to have able to support, a whole vineyard and winery. Natural wine is so risky for that kind of endeavor. I just don't think it was the right decision to make. And I think that Alexis making just incredibly high quality wines and always being able to make sure that the decision that we're making is focusing on just what can, almost an in service of the wine, what can we do for this wine, or what does this wine need? How are we going to make this into the beautiful product that it could be. And so, that being said, a lot of the wines that we make end up being kind of the conflict between us two, not in a negative way, just in the kind of resolution of how our different personalities and winemaking philosophies kind of mesh, but with Alexis as the winemaker. So ultimately, I might argue against how we do something, or a particular thing, or be hey, what if we tried this or whatever. But I think ultimately, I know that Alexis is going to be making the decision for what makes the best wine that we could, and I trust her in that. And I think that I think it's, to make really good art, often I think you really need one person more in that kind of executive role of no, this is what we're doing, this, you need a director, you need somebody who has kind of the whole goal and the whole vision in mind. And I think she just does such a beautiful job with that.
So tell me about 2025 harvest, what you're looking forward to.
In 2025, we'll have a few people like, our roommate Matthew he was with us through Harvest last year. He should be with us through Harvest again. Another Harvest intern, Jordan, was with us through Harvest last year. So I think it's going to be really fun to have a crew that has done this before, that, they will already have built up a lot of camaraderie, we'll have a good working environment together. We'll have some new additions that, are always fun. And so that it'll be nice to have a good crew. And then I think it's really nice that, each year, we try new things. We see what's working. We see what's not working. We try to always make sure that we're kind of getting feedback that we can improve from. So nobody is, I think, a harsher critic than Alexis of her wines. She is really striving for perfection, and even when we make a wine that is just absolutely beautiful, her mind's thinking, okay, what could I have done to make this better? So really each year getting to see that in action and being like, holy shit, last year was so good. And how are you improving on it? It's really awesome. And, what I'm looking forward to for 2025 is I think 2023 was landing on our feet. 2024 was trying to get in stride. And I think 2025 is going to really be in stride, being able to grow grapes, make wine, and sell the wine here on the property. And we just started working with Massinoy, who's a national importer. So they're distributing us in some states. Hopefully we're going to get picked up in a few other states soon. And so, I think that this year could really be the year where all of our kind of flows are working in terms of, we're growing grapes, making wine, selling the wine, and that's really the goal. So I think this year it really feels like the year we're hitting our stride.
You talked earlier a couple times about getting animals into the program. So tell me about the process for that and how, the progress for that and how far ahead you're looking for that.
Sure. So I think I was going to bring up this earlier, but I didn't. So industrial agriculture, Rudolf Steiner was really cool in terms of he was seeing this rollout of tanks being switched into tractors, being used in the farms, the Haber-Bosch process, creating fertilizer that we can use to, all of these the starting of this reduction of variety. You're seeing rollout. And so, Rudolf Steiner had the great idea to be okay, let's try to figure out some of these practices that people have been doing for a long time. Let's try to, stop or keep some of this knowledge going as a lot of these processes are being rolled out. And so if you're thinking of viticulture before that point, animals were just in the vines. And what we did when we took animals out of the vines is we opened up two new avenues of GDP growth. It's, okay, now we can have this entire agricultural chemical side to try to replace the fertilizing that they're doing. And then there's the mechanical mowing side that it's okay, we can have this whole industry creating all of this equipment so that we can perform the same functions that they were already performing for us. And then, a lot of the really development since then, even vertical shoot positioning and stuff, there's some really awesome benefits about it, having the fruit in a good zone for, being able to pull leaves, have either good airflow or good sunlight exposure, whatever you have the ability to do a lot of different things with that system, and it's great. But I think the thing that it does more than a lot of other systems really is that it allows for easy mechanization of labor in the vineyard. It allows for you to have a mechanical hedger. It allows for you to have mechanical leaf puller, mechanical harvesting. It was developed and rolled out in such a way because that was kind of that was the emerging form of a vineyard, was a system where we took the animals out and we replaced them with tractors that are going to be mowing and fertilizing for us. And so I think you have, Antiquum Farms is doing a really awesome program down in Eugene, where they have, they'll rotate grazing between pigs, sheep, ducks, and chickens, where kind of each is playing a different role in the ecosystem. They're co-developing in a way where, like, the chickens will eat a lot of insects and worms and stuff that could become a problem for the pigs or could be a problem for the sheep. The ducks, actually, my friend showed me a video of his ducks the other day eating voles, which are one of the huge problems we have in the vineyards. Like, they're each playing a different role in the ecosystem that in a non-gated ecosystem, like, you'll have all of these different animals performing these roles. And so I think that, I think a big impetus for my want to do it stems from kind of my biomimicry and the idea that, like, okay, well, if you want to design systems that work well with nature, the first thing you should look to is natural systems to see what they're doing, to see the interactions that they have. And I think, kind of a permaculture aspect to it as well, of then trying to add that layer of, okay, and what could we have multiple things that could perform that function, and could they also perform other functions, perhaps functions that are good for us or good for wildlife or whatever. So it's like trying to look at not just the economic calculus, but also all of the other, like, trade-offs, to me, makes it a pretty easy decision to want to use animals. It's like, okay, they are performing all of these roles for me, and really what it requires is a slightly different infrastructure. So, like, what Antiguum Farms does is they have a, like, double wire electric wire offset system where they'll have 2 electric wires on either side of every row around the fruiting zone so that the sheep aren't and the different animals aren't going to eat the grapes. Piscina's Ranch down in California did is they did, I think it's more of a kind of a lyre system. I haven't actually been down there. I've just, seen pictures or videos of it. But, they, I think, are a little bit more like what I would want to plant out here in the future whenever we're going to plant out some new land. But what I'd love to do in the future is design a trellising system that's basically going to, either it might be a lyre system, might be Geneva double curtain, might just be kind of vertical shoot positioning, but where, the trunks go 6 or 7 feet up and then the vines kind of flop, with the idea that in addition to getting the fruiting zone and everything out of the animal's way so they're not going to be a problem, it would also enable them to actually do the hedging for me. So that's another vineyard task that I won't have to do anymore, that I can just have the animals do for me, and they'll do that for me so happily and powered by solar energy, and you get to pet them, and it's just lovely, and So, yeah, that's kind of why animals in general, I would say, is just like there's a reason that before we had this massive energy surplus, that's the way that we've been doing it for a long time, because there's a lot of different trade-offs.
You mentioned this is you kind of hitting your stride this year, kind of 3 years into the kind of the process of the new winery and all of that. Yeah. Tell me, as you look ahead, short-term goals, long-term goals, as you look for the property and for the brand, what are you hoping for Vitae Springs, and kind of how far out are you looking?
Short-term goals is just sell the wine. We've increased our sales a lot, but we really didn't start selling wine very much until kind of end of 2023. But last year was really the first year where we were focusing a lot on trying to increase sales and trying to figure out the distribution channels and everything. So much of that work is work that you have to do, but in the moment it's not going to pay off, and it won't pay off until weeks, months, years later, and it's all kind of a cumulative process of building that brand and networking and getting your name and reputation out there. And I think that short-term goals is to just continue kind of building that brand and getting our reputation out there and building up the sales channels that we need to continue doing this into the long term. And then the long term, one of my long-term goals would be to build a winery here. I have, I think, some pretty cool ideas for what kind of winery I'd want to build, in terms of really focusing on kind of energy flows, the different technologies we have available now. I think we could build, if you're thinking about it in the right way, I think you could build almost like a winery that's practically a living system, that, you have solar panels on the top, that you have a kind of tiered energy use where, you might have some batteries, but those are like the last tier of the energy system whenever, you've already heated the glycol or cooled the glycol and to the proper temperatures, you've already condensed, I guess, so if you're thinking of fermentation or whatever. Like there's a few things that you want to do for it. One is you might want to control the temperature, whether that's heating it up or cooling it down. You might want to control the atmosphere, the environment around it, whether that's, using inert gas like argon to make sure there's no oxygen, or put it in an environment where it's slowly receiving oxygen, or oxidizing it if you're trying to make an oxidative style. And then, while that ferment is fermenting, it's producing a lot of CO2. So, we could be we're producing a lot of CO2. Also, in the winery, we're using CO2 as an inert gas. So, especially if you're designing the system really well, you could be trying to capture that CO2 into some sort of reservoir that then, whenever you have solar energy, whenever the sun's shining and you don't have a higher priority for the energy use, then you can be using that to condense that down to some liquid CO2 that then you can be using for the winery. Or, if, you have plenty of liquid CO2, then, maybe it's hooked up to some network of CO2 sequestration between wineries or something. And, the solar panels on top could be also, the other higher priority things are during harvest. Yeah, you're going to want to be powering all of your expensive and energy intensive equipment and stuff. But whenever you're not doing that, then you're heating these reservoirs that if you designed the plumbing really intelligently, you could even have passive cooling from just the kind of dynamics of how the heat is flowing throughout your different systems and stuff. So I just think that we have the technology that we could make incredibly energy efficient designs that can last for an incredibly long time. And so I think kind of one of my long-term goals is definitely trying to build this, while we still have a really good kind of energy surplus, and it's still affordable to do.
How have you seen the Oregon wine industry change? You haven't been in it for too long yet, but you've been around long enough to see some evolution and growth. What does the industry look like now compared to when you started? If at all.
Yeah, I think consolidations is going to be the biggest one for sure, in terms of you just have a lot of big forces with money and private equity groups and everything that are wanting a piece of kind of the growing Oregon market. I just went to the Hi-Fi put on a really fun Temperance Hill tasting the other day, and it was so awesome to get to see so many people throughout my kind of past few years here in the Valley. And so it's fun that I think that the people are still here. All of the people that have been contributing to and making this such an awesome place to be are still here. I just think you kind of maybe have different, I think it has a different reputation that I think that Oregonians have been doing an awesome job at kind of building up our brand here in the Willamette Valley for a long time, and we're really starting to see the effects of that take hold in terms of consolidation, in terms of, acclaim globally, in terms of some of the best wines in the world coming out of here in the past few years. I think that since 2020, I think we've been blessed with 4 really awesome vintages. Here at Vitae Springs especially, I know, 2022, you had a lot of frost and you had a lot of people who were really impacted by that. We weren't here. So, 3 or 4 really good vintages. I think you've seen a lot of other wine regions that have not had that. Maybe they had great vintages in 2020, but they've had a lot of struggles, and we've been very fortunate here. That I think has timing-wise worked out really awesome to kind of hop on top of all of that brand building that we've been doing to, I think, put real interest and put some real global eyes on the Willamette Valley right now.
What happens next for the industry?
I think one of the things that happens next is we have to figure out how to sell our wine to people who are the primary wine market has been boomers and Gen X. I think that we're going to have to figure out how to sell our wine to people with different values and people with, in general, less money. I think that'll change in the future and stuff, but I think that a lot of, especially luxury wine, how we've been doing that brand building has been exclusive in a lot of ways and been kind of out of touch for a lot of the younger generations. And so I think that there's a kind of, there's a lack of interest, especially among like the biggest wineries. I think there's a lot of lack of interest in wine that, like I going into the statistics, I think it's interesting that, there's some, like the wine brands that are struggling the most are going to be like those low cost grocery store brands that, just as I think Gen Z and millennials and stuff tend to not drink quite as much, and those markets are the ones that are kind of being hit the worst. But it's also interesting seeing that they're buying a lot more about value, not both I guess in terms of like cost value, but also in terms of the kind of values associated with the brand or style or whatever. And so I think really the key there, once again, I think comes back to kind of regenerative agriculture. I think that realistically, regenerative agriculture is kind of one of the only viable agricultural systems for a warmer world, primarily because of just the increase in resilience. If you're an industrialized farm, you're reliant on global supply chains, where you could have an issue like we saw with the pandemic, where you have an issue in China that cascades over the entire network of the world, and then you're running into all of these issues here on your farm. Whereas if you are at a regenerative farm and you've already localized the supply chains as much as you possibly can, then you are a much more resilient system. And then you also have the actual like farm ecosystem that is also a lot more resilient if you're not focusing on monocultures. If the amount of water that if you build up some soil carbon, the amount more water that your soil can absorb is absolutely incredible. Like it could very easily be the thing that allows your vines to make it through a drought where a lot of other vines did not. And the more we do that, and the more we are building up, rebuilding our forests, whether it's rewilding or agroforestry or whatever, like there are all of these like kind of positive benefits from this increased biodiversity that we are still receiving a lot of, especially locally, but less so than we have for a lot of the past. Like, I guess I think of like, I like the kind of concept in environmental economics of, ecosystem services of like, a tree, in addition to, a tree economically is really only classified like as like lumber or whatever. Like that's the value in it, is whenever you cut it down and you make a product out of it. What is ignored in our economic system are all of these services that tree is providing, from carbon sequestration, from generating rain by all of the different like pollens and everything, kind of forming catalysts for rain and everything. Like there are so many benefits that you're getting from all of these things that are just not part of our economic calculus, and that is how we make our decisions. So I think the future for the wine industry is really going to be about kind of being the champions of regenerative agriculture, because especially in Oregon, where we are, for whatever reason, we are pretty much only in the luxury market of wine, we have the margins where we are able to be on the technological forefront, on the cultural forefront of regenerative agriculture, and try to really be like the champions for, Gen Z and millennials and Gen Alpha as they come of age. We can be the champions that are trying to fight for, the agricultural system that actually makes sense for our specific circumstances.
You mentioned your side brand earlier. Tell us about that and how it's going so far.
Sure. So I started a wine brand called Cynic Wines. It is named after the Greek philosophers, the Cynics. I'm a huge fan of philosophy. It's one of my other passions. And I think that there are some really... So I guess a few things. One, Cynic, the term means dog-like, and I love dogs, so I do like dogs. But it was definitely like meant to be like an insulting term for the people who are following the practices. But the Cynics were kind of all about like trying to not care about societal values necessarily. They're more caring about like the reality of the world and like trying to outside of the current value system, like try to figure out what value systems make sense. And, philosophy, I think there have been so many books that I've read in philosophy that have really just like transformed me. And like some of just like it's really hard to describe like the experience of reading, Meditations by Descartes. Like if you're really engaging with it and you haven't yet encountered that kind of thought, it's just so transformative to be like, holy shit, like, I think therefore I am, like the actual meaning of that is really like, if I'm really thinking about it, like there are like, I guess I like existentialists where it kind of more moves to there are thoughts as opposed to I'm thinking therefore I am. But it's like just like it gets to the foundations of like what it is to be a human. And like, a lot of philosophy is about like how to live a good life. And it's like, but it's not just like it just, you get into the semantics of like what all of the words mean. And like, there's just so many values that are construed that are tied to the language that you're using. And just philosophy allowed me to like break out of like a lot of the assumptions about how the world works and really engage with it and be like, okay, like, does that make sense? Like, really just trying to create value systems or kind of create concepts that really like make sense given your specific context. Because also, philosophy is interesting in that, you're reading something, especially if it's, Greek philosophy and it's from 2,000 years ago, like it's such a different context and yet it still resonates with you because there's a lot of shared experience of just humanity and stuff. But it's also like, it's so interesting to be able to see those shared experiences and also see how that thought has developed, but also see what parts of it are shared in that human experience versus more kind of temporal, like tied to that society or that culture or whatever, like definitely in a lot of philosophy, you're like, man, you're saying some really interesting stuff, but also like, wow, you're racist. Like those are some racist ass thoughts. Like for me, like philosophy is just like it's so much about like just being human and like trying to engage with the world and like kind of be like, why? And so my brand is Natural Wines 00, no additions. My goal is no filtrations. I have 2 wines this year where I have a skin contact Viognier from Croft Vineyards that I just bottled. And then I have a white Viognier from Croft Vineyards that I have not yet bottled because it still has some sugar and it's not finishing up. So I haven't decided what I'm going to do with it, if I'm going to filter it and declassify it in a sense of just like, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do since it's my first wine that I'm launching. I have a lot more luxury than like if I've done this for 10 years. So, it'll be a question of whether I filter it and declassify it or filter it and just put that on the bottle. Like actually this wine, I don't like filtering, but this wine is filtered because it had sugar left in it and just kind of explain it. Because I care a lot about openness and transparency in winemaking. I think one of the first people who we really met here and why we ended up making wine at Craft Wines in 2019 was Chad and Bree Stock, and like, their whole idea of like putting the ingredients on the labels and stuff. Like I really just kind of appreciate that kind of transparency of like, yeah, I do want to know what has been done to this wine. And whether that's from a winemaker point of like, man, like, what did you do? This is so cool. Or like, health point of like, I want to know what to put in my body. Like, I think being open is just, I think, the best way for consumers and the wine industry in the long term. And so I think that, and for me, natural wine is like, it's hard. I use a lot of inert gas, which, I'm sure I'm going to meet somebody who's going to be like, this wine is not natural. You use dry ice. And I'm like, okay, sorry, then my bad. But I use a lot of inert gas because in how I want to make really clean wines, especially this Viognier that I was working with, I wanted to let it ripen, let it develop a lot of flavor. So I'm working with high pHs with these. High pH, no sulfur is a very delicate environment to keep as wine because, wine is just one of the things that happens to grapes before they turn into vinegar, so like keeping it at that wine and not letting it turn into vinegar requires a really delicate hand, and I think that I think of my natural wine brand kind of more as an art project, or I kind of think of it as like, almost like walking a tightrope, or like bowling without bumpers, where it's just like I want to do it, and like I love the idea of doing it, and like that's my passion, and that's what I really want to do. But like, I don't want necessarily to, like, I think with Alexis especially, I think that I'd rather, if like I see that it's going to go towards the gutter, I'm about to fall off or whatever, I'd prefer to rescue it and then declassify it, and have kind of those ones that truly I succeeded with, and like I just brought some grapes, kept them as wine until you got to drink it. Like those wines are kind of like my most beautiful ones that I want to prize the most. And the ones that don't make it, I still want to be pleasant to drink. So I would rather lose the purity of natural or whatever than like lose the wine. Yeah.
All right. I think that's all the questions I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover today that you wanted to cover?
I don't think so.
Excellent.
Cool.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with us, share this beautiful space with us on this semi-sunny June day today. We appreciate you taking the time to be part of our project, and we'll let you off the hook.
Yeah.